Hello, welcome to the Socratic Society's YouTube channel. We have Peter Williams here to discuss the argument from desire. This is for those of you who can't make the event that we have starting about half an hour where we'll be debating this topic. So Peter, what is the argument from desire?
Well, I'd say that the argument from desire is really a family of arguments that seek to move from various human desires to conclusions that are supportive of belief in God.
Yeah. Do you have any examples maybe of the types of desires that you're talking about?
Sure. I think we'll talk a little bit more at length in a moment about the kind of desire that C.S. Lewis very famously focused on in his writings. But I would say what I would call existentially relevant desires. If you have desires for things like ultimate justice, for your being to be loved and validated in a sort of ultimate sense, for there to be meaning and real purpose to your existence, for example.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned C.S. Lewis's argument. We can maybe focus on that one, try and understand what you're saying, and then maybe ask a couple of questions, raise a few objections.
Sure.
So, yeah, C.S. Lewis's argument.
Lewis, in various of his writings in different ways, put a lot of focus on an experience that he called in some places joy, as in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. But which rises in the German Romantic tradition called Sehnsucht. And Lewis described this experience as a desire that was unsatisfied, but that was in itself more desirable than any other apparent satisfaction in life. That this sort of yearning desire for something more beyond what the world could kind of give us in answer to our desires. And that this very experience of being unsatisfied with our existence in the world seemed to point to something innately desirable that transcended the world. And this very kind of experience of lacking this fulfillment was itself a desire that was more desirable than any other satisfaction that life had to offer.
So is it just kind of a longing for meaning and fulfillment, or is he maybe talking about something slightly different?
I think slightly different. I think he's talking about an apparent desire for something that appears, when you're having the desire, to be an innately desirable, who knows, something beyond the world and beyond the things of the world that we can look to satisfy our desires. That we have this restlessness for something more, and we have these experiences often evoked by, say, natural beauty, but then we find the desire evoked by looking at the stars at night. But it's not a desire for the stars. Okay. Right? It's a desire for something that seems to be a transcendent, innately desirable something, or maybe someone, right?
Can you maybe just give a few more examples of where this desire would, when it is evoked in people maybe, and then you can try and get a handle on what that means?
Sure. Well, in his study, Bright Shadow of Reality, a study that came out, famous book from the 70s, Corbin Scott Carnell analysed the literary tradition about this kind of joy experience, or Sehnsucht, as the German sort of Romantic tradition puts it. And he argues that this desire is as widespread a theme in Western literature as the theme of love is, for example. And I think the things that evoke this desire but don't satisfy it in people tends to be very person-relative, but often, at least, has to do with the beauty of the natural world, with what the Romantic tradition would have called the sublime. And people can have that experience in, listening to the music of Bach, or looking at the sky at night through a telescope, or all sorts of things that people, I think, in our culture would often associate with a sense of spirituality.
Yeah.
People talk about going and walking in nature for not just health benefits, but the spirituality of it. There's something that we sense, something more, that is, as I say, evoked by these things around us that we experience. But we also know that those things around us that evoke this desire don't satisfy it, don't answer it. They just evoke it and seem therefore to sort of point in a sort of a world transcending manner.
Okay, so to try and track what we've got so far, are you saying there's this desire that is often evoked when we're doing things that people might regard as spiritual, such as listening to Beethoven or going for a walk in nature, seeing beautiful scenes, contemplating, I don't know, the stars at night, maybe thinking about legendary stories and so on. And you're saying that this desire seems to be kind of transcendent, and you think that points towards a transcendent reality, or
there are certainly ways of putting that experience into an argument. At a most basic level, if we're saying, and this will resonate clearly most with people who think that they've had that experience, right? But that if we have an experience in which it seems to us that there's this innately desirable transcendence, something more, then why not trust that experience? This would be on various what I call epistemologies of trust, or theories of when it's reasonable to trust your experience. Principles like the famous Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne talks about the principle of credulity, or when to trust, that we should take our experience as being reliable about reality until and unless we've got a good enough reason to doubt it. He says you don't start out in a position of automatic skepticism about your experiences, because if you did that, then nothing could ever convince you of anything, because you'd always be skeptical about any argument brought, or any experience brought to kind of overturn your skepticism. He says the thing to do is we start by saying, I have various experiences, seem to be experiences of reality, and it's reasonable to take those experiences at face value until I've got good enough reason to doubt it. So if we have this experience ourselves, or we're prepared to take other people's word for it that they have this experience, and it's one that appears to the people who have it to point beyond the world, then that kind of theory of knowledge would say, well, take that at face value unless someone gives you a good enough reason not to do it.
Okay.
And so just at a very basic level, we seem to have this experience, we trust that experience, so it seems to be evidence of something more.
Yeah. And I think quite a few people would maybe bring the charge that this is sort of wishful thinking. We want there to be something after death, or we're scared of death, something like that. Therefore we come up with this, we have this desire to avoid it, and that's why we have it. So, how would you respond to someone who brings that charge?
Yeah, so that's very much taking a sort of automatically skeptical view of those experiences, and saying any desire or experience you have that seems to fit with what you want, this is very a kind of Freudian way of attacking beliefs, is kind of thereby automatically suspect. And that, I think, just cuts against the grain of the way that philosophers in thinking about the theory of knowledge have kind of gone over the last half century or more. And it also becomes a kind of two-bladed, two-edged weapon. You can always say, well, you are skeptical of that experience being real because you don't want there to be something more. Right? Maybe if you can psychoanalyze my desires in order to undercut my belief, then I can do the same to you. And actually what we're not working on a basis of undercutting each other's beliefs by psychoanalyzing them, but saying people have certain experiences, and epistemologies of trust, phenomenal conservatism, or Swinburne's principle of credulity and so on would say the reasonable thing to do is start out in a position of trust until you've got sufficient reason to doubt. Now, is a Freudian, undercutter a sufficient reason to doubt? I would say, I think not, for various reasons, including that, well, that's a kind of two-edged sword that can end up with you just, you can think up an inventive enough kind of psychoanalyzing away people's beliefs in a way that would mean that you're kind of dropped into a pit of skepticism about so much that it would be really difficult to live your life. Right?
So is it you saying that you're having a call for consistency here, and you think that people have to be consistent in how they're applying this?
Yes, that may be one way of putting it, that you can't just apply that kind of Freudian critique to views you don't like. You have to think, well, what would happen if I also applied that Freudian critique to my own views, to my own belief in the utility of the Freudian critique of things. You see how things can become kind of
defeating itself almost in some way.
So that's the problem with starting with a skeptical approach, rather than an approach that says actually start out with trust but be open to appropriate skepticism.
Okay. Well, how about if someone's maybe taking a more, evolutionary attack on the arguments? They're saying, I have sense perception, but it makes sense that I have that because it helps me see my environment, helps me survive. The same for hearing and critical thinking and so on. And they can maybe say this desire could actually be false if it helps us strive to reproduce more, maybe by having sex or something, or if it gets us to seek out new lands or be inventive, something along those lines. And essentially there's an explanation for this. It helps us survive in some way, and you don't need to say, there's this whole other transcendent realm, because that's quite a big thing to posit, at least on a naturalistic view.
Yes, at least on a naturalistic view. That's the thing with these, again, kind of undercutting De Vita of saying, well, maybe there's an evolutionary account that's consistent with you having experience X, Y, or Z, be that sense experience of reality as you engage with it, or the desire for an apparent something more, is putting the full stop on that account requires adding a naturalistic worldview to the scientific evolutionary account. And that's a philosophical step that needs justification. Also, note that the attempt to say, well, maybe this would be an evolutionary advantage if such and such conditions were fulfilled. So it's very kind of explanatorily vague. I could also say, well, yeah, maybe, but maybe beings who found themselves with this sense of longing for something more than the world could give them would be outcompeted by beings who didn't have that sense of longing, because they would fall into an existential ennui and go, nothing in life seems to satisfy me, and they would perhaps get down a sort of existential ennui that would mean that people who didn't have it would outcompete them.
Could I maybe try and strengthen the argument against here? So, for example, I think there's quite a bit of evidence that kind of religiosity is actually beneficial for individuals and their communities. So, evolutionarily speaking, if that's going to help them survive and thrive, having something that triggers that within people, which maybe this longing for something more does, it helps them foster this belief in the afterlife, helps them become religious and so on. that could then help them survive? Do you think that'd be a kind of plausible explanation? And I guess the question would be, if this explanation is just as good as the theistic hypothesis, or just the transcendent hypothesis, I'm not quite sure which one you're alluding to here, which conclusion you're alluding to, wouldn't that kind of say, this argument isn't really helping one worldview over the other?
Right. I mean, here I want to make the distinction between the survival of the fittest and the arrival of the fittest. The argument you're putting, first of all, it says, if beings that have this experience should occur, maybe that experience would have survival value. And we can question the maybe, but note the if that arrives.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you can, on an abductive version of the argument, you can compare how likely you think such an experience is to arise within a population to be selectable on a naturalistic versus on a theistic worldview. Okay. And so long as the answer on a naturalistic worldview is less probable than the answer on a theistic worldview, it's evidence that counts in favour of theism. And I would say, even if you, and I don't think you really can in detail, give an account evolutionary of how some genetic mutation or epigenetic mutation could then lead to this conscious desire, you need to solve the hard problem of consciousness to give a real kind of a scientific account of that, as it were. But then trying to strengthen the argument by linking that to religiosity has social benefits, which I think, the research does show. But in the first generation, that you happen to have creatures who have this existential desire, they also, in the same generation, have to have this religious kind of outgrowth from it. If the religious outgrowth is doing the work in your argument. Otherwise, you have, generation 1, mutation, creature that has this sense of existential desire. Well, when does that connect to producing religiosity that has community benefits? Okay, if it doesn't happen in the first generation, you have to say that the desire in and of itself is a selectable advantage, and we're back to the previous argument. If you say that it comes packaged with the religious benefits, well, that seems a lot more implausible on a naturalistic account.
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering whether it would be, like, it could kind of come in by chance, just some random mutation, and some random mutations aren't helpful and they die out, some are helpful, they stay, some are getting kind of neutral and they maybe stay, so it could come in, it could be neutral for a while, then religion could develop, it could help, and then that could be helpful. And from what I understand, I think if I understand you correctly, you were saying that could happen, but maybe that it's just less expected on the kind of atheistic worldview than it would be on a theistic one.
I'm saying so long as it is less expected on an atheistic or naturalistic worldview than you think it is on a theistic worldview, then it's evidence that counts in favour of that theistic worldview. Might not be very strong evidence, but all we're asking is the existence of this experience something that is evidence for one worldview over another?
Okay, that sounds like probably a good place to park that one. What about people who say, taking drugs, probably specifically psychedelics or something, gives them this connection with the transcendent? Would you say that kind of undercuts this argument in any way? And also,
sure.
And are you saying that this is an argument for just a transcendent reality, or an argument for God specifically?
Thank you for pinning me down on that, because I think you can, as I say, it's a family of arguments, and you can run it in various ways and up to various different conclusions, right? And sometimes you can extend those conclusions. So a lot of times I think the argument can be put as an argument against a materialistic or naturalistic understanding of the world. Then you can extend that and say, and it's also an argument in favour of some kind of personal reality beyond the world that's able to satisfy these desires that we're talking about, and then start unpacking what kind of qualities would that personal reality have to have if it's going to satisfy the particular desires that we're talking about. So one way that I really like running the argument, for example, is to, in dialogue with the kind of the French existentialist movement and so on, and talking about the absurdity of life on the materialistic worldview, and saying we have these desires for meaning, for value, of objective discoverable value, for objective discoverable purpose in life, and to point out that I think basically the tradition of atheist nihilists and existentialists who say if there's no God, really there can't be any such thing as an objective meaning or value or purpose to life. And I say, yeah, I agree with that, and there are arguments for that. But it sure seems to me like life is objectively valuable.
And is this coming back to the principle of credulity? As you,
right.
So
I would lever that principle to say, actually, life does seem like that. Or you could put it this way. You could say, yes, Camus was right to say that if we have these desires for meaning and purpose and X, Y, and Z, that the universe can't answer on his materialistic worldview. Reality is absurd to the extent that we find ourselves with these desires that the reality that produces this can't answer. And I say, okay, but is life absurd? To the extent that you actually think in your experience that life is not absurd, that there is real meaning, there is real value, that there is a point to loving people for what they intrinsically are, and so on.
Yeah.
You would say, via the principle of credulity, perhaps, that you can rebound the steps of that argument and say, and therefore the preconditions of that meaningfulness and value and so on must be in place.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is an argument that points towards a transcendent, personal, wholly good, most beautiful being, God.
Okay. And was I think, I don't want to rehash too much of what you were saying before, but you were saying that principle of credulity is kind of necessary to avoid some kind of vicious skepticism, and therefore anyone who's not a vicious skeptic kind of naturally employs it.
That's right, yeah. And that in any argument, what arguments do, basically, is attach price tags to denying their conclusion. That's what an argument tries to do. And of course, anyone prepared to pay the price tag in order to avoid the conclusion can do that. So if the committed nihilist wants to say, no, I'm going to bite the bullet, as it were, I'm sticking to my guns, life is meaningless and absurd, and there's no point to anything, well then that argument that I just gave will not change their mind, right? But if you say that nihilistic embrace seems to be too high a price tag to pay just to avoid the conclusion that there's a God, then the argument will have some purchase on you and motivate you to be well disposed towards the conclusion.
Yeah. And in kind of bridging the gap, because I think you were saying that this desire was kind of primarily for a transcendent, not necessarily specifically for a God. Were you just saying that God is the most reasonable form of transcendent reality or something? Or
right. So, as I say, when you put the argument, you can kind of start off with a more minimal conclusion, and just argue for there's a world transcending something, which is a conclusion that busts a naturalistic kind of one-story view of reality, worldview. But it doesn't settle the differences between lots of other views that one might have compatible with that. Yeah. So that's a kind of minimalistic conclusion. But as I say, there are ways of running the argument, and I think particularly the ways that connect with those existential desires for meaning, purpose, objective value, justice, love, and so on. These are terms which, in our experience, are to do with personal realities, and that gets us more towards the realm of theism. Very few theistic arguments try and do the whole thing in one. Yeah. Try and argue the whole show in one. What often we're doing when we're considering arguments for or against any worldview is looking at a whole bunch of arguments and saying, taken together in comparison with the overall case for the other views, which view of reality do I find overall making the best case for it? And so I think, you don't, generally speaking, look for one argument to try and prove everything, but if you have an argument that, does some of the work for you by either being against one or more alternative views, or arguing for something that's unique to a particular view, or arguing for more things as you think about the argument more, and put it together with other arguments. So this kind of transcendent yearning you could see as a kind of negative version of what you might call positive arguments from religious experience. The kind of different sides of the same coin in a sense. The existential argument about meaning and purpose is obviously very closely connected to, say, the meta-ethical argument from moral values and moral duties and so on. I don't think we have time to go into that one. They don't seem to have particularly much to do with, say, cosmological arguments for the existence of God, but that's got to play a part in our overall thinking about the matters as well. So it's only going to do part of the job for us, and we shouldn't expect more from it than is reasonable.
So you're saying it's just one piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
One part of the jigsaw puzzle. That's a good way of putting it.
I think that's all we have time for, but thank you for your time, Peter.
Pleasure. Thank you very much,
I look forward to hearing your opening speech.
Thanks.
Thank you.